our great work, research and educational work that I think will be central to this. So I'd like to just start with a bit of an introduction. I'd say all of us experience everywhere we go, pretty much every day, someone talking about big data, data sciences, artificial intelligence, augmented intelligence, as Jenny Romedy likes to call it, machine learning. And we know that we all need this, and it's essential for what we're doing. We know that we have terrific opportunities with data. Data is essential to help us make better decisions and to have the right kinds of decisions at the right times. And then our analysis is essential, analysis of that data. We're told that data is the solution, and yet there are clouds on the horizon that data might also be part of the problem. And we worry about this data, and we worry about privacy because hazards abound. We feel, on the one hand, we rely on our data to find our way to and from events in Davos or wherever we may be. But we know that they're also people are able to track our whereabouts, to understand where we're eating, what we're doing, who we're with, and where we're spending our time. So we rely on this information, and yet we worry about our privacy. And these two are very much at odds, and we have a wonderful group to talk about this today. I wrote a blog about this subject, and I was pleased to see them picking up my George Orwell 1984 theme with the image on that blog. And the image was Big Data is watching you, and very reminiscent of Big Brother is watching you. And I thought that George Orwell's quote from that book, which I'll remind you was published in 1948, was that if you want to keep a secret, you must also hide it from yourself. These days, I think we're all realizing that we're both using and generating tremendous quantities of data and information. Well, we have a fabulous panel to help us grapple with this. And we're going to start with my dear colleague, Yves-Alexandre de Montjoy, who heads Imperial College London's Computational Privacy Group. He's also an assistant professor at Imperial College and was special advisor to the European Commission, competition commissioners and investigator, and he's an expert called upon by many, in particular the UN, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and others. Yves-Alexandre's research is fascinating. He not only studies privacy and anonymity and things like that, but he also studies attacks and will help us with systems and algorithms and protocols that will help us protect ourselves better. We also have Rohit Chopra, who's a federal trade commissioner, who's a very strong advocate for fair and functional marketplace through enforcement that protects those families and honest companies that are doing the right things and protects them from illegal actors. The Federal Trade Commission is, of course, extremely important in this regard. And Rohit has been a leader and pushed for aggressive actions against law-breaking companies. So I'm looking forward to this opportunity. Unfortunately, Rohit has to leave us, so he's going to be here for the first part and get us thinking about these topics. And then we will carry on, and I'll welcome our next panelist to the stage. So I'd like to start just with Yves-Alexandre. You've done pioneering research on anonymized data. And you and your team are continually revealing flaws in what we count upon for security and for privacy. I thought maybe you could set the stage for this balance between using data, having the great access to and ability to have great amounts of data that help us, and the concerns we have about our privacy.
No, absolutely happy to. So I think basically for us, the biggest challenge is really how can we help technically find a balance between using data and preserving privacy, and really trying to use technology to break what is presented as a trade-off or choice you need to make between using data and preserving privacy. And we do think that with the right tools, you can actually find a balance. You can actually use data, train AI on large-scale data sets while truly preserving the privacy of the individual. A lot of our research has been focused on basically attacks and trying to find and prove flaws in algorithms and protocols that had been proposed to anonymize data, mostly showing that the traditional release and forget model, this idea that you can take a data set, modify it one way or the other, and preserve privacy, might have worked in the past, might have worked in 1995 when the first algorithms to anonymize data were invented, but we think do not work anymore today, do not work with the kind of large-scale data sets that we are collecting and using today.
So, Rohit, you're such a strong advocate for these, for privacy, for regulations that will protect people. And knowing what you know and knowing about Yves-Alexandre's work, do you think these tools are effective? And what would you say about our ability to balance the ability to use data for all these things we need it for, and yet preserve privacy as needed?
Yeah, well, just to put it in context, I think that you're seeing Europe, China, and the US all being very aggressive in AI strategies as part of supporting the economy. It's a national security imperative. And one of my concerns writ large about mass data collection is that while it has some important advantages that we can use to innovate, we want to make sure that the first mover advantages are not winner take all, because that is only going to advantage those who feel that a surveillance type society is an appropriate way of living. And I think in the US and Europe, we really believe that we should not have a surveillance society, even though we do. I think our surveillance society may not be in our government, but it certainly is the case in our digital lives when we engage in commerce or social media or search or whatever it may be. So I guess I think of this in a few different pockets. One, what is the business model that is driving this mass data harvesting? And I think at the core of that is the behavioral advertising model that companies like Google and Facebook engage in, where they're seeking to collect massive amounts of data, use AI tools and machine learning to be able to, in some ways, manipulate you into certain actions that are financially profitable for them. So I think about business models. I also think a lot about what's the right space for the private sector versus the public sector. And so I think there's a school of thought, which I observe both in Europe and the US, that the way we're going to stay ahead of the game on AI is if we really allow the private sector and private capital to drive all of that. And I'm concerned that that can be at odds with, some of our basic human rights and values. So I'm fine if the private sector wants to, do lots of measurements on temperatures and scientific measurements. But when it comes to our personal movements and what we are consuming, I think that's where we need to draw some lines and say, you know what, if there are huge advantages of developing an AI strategy that we need a lot of personal data, it needs the framework and protections that maybe only the public sector can offer. And I think that's separate and apart from regulation. Regulation, I think, can play a role, but some of these activities in data harvesting and surveillance maybe just shouldn't exist in the commercial sector. So I think, in the US, a lot of people talk about Xinjiang and China and a surveillance state, but I think, in our own lives, we are tracked every single moment of the day, but it's just in the private sector. So I think we have to attack that and really think of this not just from issues of commerce and issues of technology, but also national security, because increasingly this is going to become a national security imperative.
All of our jogging routes around the compound and such. But we do willfully do this. We do willfully track our runs and our walks. In fact, if I go on an exercise and don't have my phone, I feel like I don't get credit for it. I don't know who I'm trying to get credit from. God in the cloud, watching over me to make sure I get my steps in. But I'm sure others of you feel like, oh my, I left my phone, I can't exercise. I mean, we willfully do this. And I've seen Yves-Alexandre has a marvelous, I would commend all of you to go look at some of his lectures on YouTube, but there's this really fascinating sets of information that can really pinpoint who's who. What do you think about this public versus private? That that data is being collected by whom and for what, and should we worry about it, or
Yeah, no, I mean, and it's. I think I absolutely agree. I think I mean, on the one hand, I do data privacy. On the other hand, most of the algorithm we use come from AI and machine learning, and so I'm permanently torn between privacy and seeing all the good that can come from using this data. And I think I absolutely do agree. We have to, on the one hand, really recognize the potential of data for good, and in a sense, like, Ken Cukier used to say that, like, not using data is like burning books. I think it's a bit provocative, but gets the point across that really there is so much we can do for good using this data in developing countries for medical research and a lot of other, like, excellent applications. My concern that I think I share with Rohit is really when this for good and the benefit that can come from using this data comes at the expense of privacy. When it's being portrayed as either you have this good or you have privacy, but you cannot have both. And if you want this good, you need to give up on privacy. And I think that's I fundamentally take offense with that view. I think in Europe we do see privacy as a human right and not something that we can trade. And then from a research standpoint, it's really how can we suggest solutions and ways to train AI while preserving privacy, very much with a lot of the data and a lot of the AI being done in the private sector. And really, fundamentally to me, privacy is about trust and really the government helping build trust and truly privacy being an enabler for the data economy. Privacy being an enabler for data to be used more, but better.
So, Rohit, can we find those regulatory approaches that use perhaps the latest technologies, the latest research, our understanding as it stands today, and build the right kinds of regulations or regulatory frameworks that will balance this equation?
Yeah, and I want to go back to, it's key to look at where the abuse is occurring. So that requires not just a long list of requirements on how to safeguard data. It also needs to look directly at what are the business incentives that lead to data being used in some ways for profit, but also leading to harm. I mean, just think about the YouTube platform is used to recruit people for ISIS. It is used to spread misinformation. And
it's used to have Yves-Alexandre's great lectures on. It's
right, but here's the thing, though. But Yves-Alexandre's lectures don't enrage people and is not extremist. And so YouTube's algorithm may not be promoting it, as opposed to when its business incentive is to promote the most engaging or enraging content for its own financial gain, that they're putting a thumb on the scale. So I think I'm thinking a lot about this not through a long list of requirements, but the business incentives and also consolidation. Antitrust enforcement is a key part of this, which is that if firms are vertically integrating or using their dominance in one set of data to create dominance in another, we know that there's first mover advantages in collecting a lot of this data. And you see it from venture capital investors. They don't want to invest in a lot of data intensive industries because once the first person has gone, they grow exponentially and it's hard to catch up. So we have to, I think we will get it right, but it's not going to happen if we don't closely examine some of these business models.
So as you look at, and I know you would like to have U.S. federal legislation on these matters, do you look at GDPR as an example? Do you look at the states that have built their own legislations? What's your thought on the best approach for now?
More privacy protections are, of course, good. I support states also trying to pass their own laws. This month, California Consumer Privacy Act came online. I think all of those are good, but the conversation in the U.S. is moving beyond just privacy, but also tech reform. So what are we going to do to examine how the tech industry, particularly some of their business models, may lead to other problems that are imposed on society? And I think getting the cracking down on abuse of data is critical. And what we're learning at home is that these big fines for big companies are not big penalties. And it's not going to change their behavior. So we're going to have to, again, really look at those business models.
So we only have a few minutes with you. I know you have to run. I would like to see if you have a message to stakeholders, because we have government, we have corporate, we have academic stakeholders. What would that message be? And perhaps we could take a few questions if there are any questions from the audience.
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a myth that great progress in technology is all due to the genius of a tech company founder. I mean, this is false. I think we see it as part of there would be no internet, there would be no iPhone, there would be so many of the innovations without the basic investments in scientific research that the U.S. government and its taxpayers made, and that's true across the globe. So I think we need to remember that some of the foundational technology we should think about, is the public sector a place we need to invest in so that the discoveries and trade secrets and patents are not locked up just for private gain, but can advance our entire society for everyone's benefits. And we know that collecting health data, collecting transportation data, all of this is going to help make our lives better. But as soon as it is distorted by the profit motive of an individual firm, we have to deal with the consequences of that. So that's one thing that I hope we can really rethink as we move forward in thinking about tech policy for the U.S. and Europe.
That's a great message, because we certainly have benefited tremendously from U.S. funding when Yves-Alexandre was a grad student and still collaborates with MIT, from European Union support and UK government support. We do tend to focus on the science and technology, and we have to make sure we're supporting the kinds of research that will help us with those practicalities and those outcomes further down, and can really look into the longer term, because this isn't something we can just do swiftly. I think we do need to find that right path to find that balance.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Would anyone like to ask Commissioner? Yes. Jonathan.
I just wanted to ask a super quick question. Rohit, I just want to push you a little bit. I mean, you're absolutely right that the business model of a lot of these internet companies, is to get more clicks and so forth. But if that really were what were driving them, then surely on the front page of Google we would see, I don't know, pornography and how to make a nuclear bomb. But we sort of don't. So how far do you want to push that notion? How far do you want to push that notion?
Well, I'm not saying that Google's promoting that it's about pornography. I think that the idea is there are distorted incentives when your job and your profit motive is to engage in mass surveillance. So I hope I'm understanding your question right. We obviously want data to be used for good, but when data is being collected in ways that no one seems to want or understand, and when companies are so dominant using one-sided terms of agreement, terms of service, and they want to call it free, But you're paying. You're paying with data, and they are collecting more and more and more, and that's like a price hike. So I'm not sure if I'm addressing your question right, but I do think that if we want real advancements, we can't just rely on a national champion strategy of a few big firms driving most of the innovation. It needs to be dispersed. It needs to be competitive. That's really, I see how the U.S. really jumped ahead in technology, is because there was a major culture of new entrants, and when there was dominance, antitrust action was taken. You know, when there would be no Amazon, Google, or Facebook without that Microsoft action by the U.S. and EU. There would have been no many firms without the early actions against AT&T and Bell Labs. So I think that's just a critical part of how we should approach this.
I was curious for you to expand on your thoughts about federal level action on privacy in the United States, and to offer up what could be considered a moderate analogy. If we look at state level action around, marijuana on the one hand and guns on the other, if you don't like one state's laws about guns, you buy it in another state and you drive across. Same thing with marijuana. What is your view of that balkanized approach to privacy? Is it a good thing, or is it something that the federal government needs to take action on?
Well, I think the federal Congress should pass something, and it should go beyond privacy. It should go to broader issues in tech. But look, I think there's a narrative that the industry wants to propagate that states are not actually talking to each other. In fact, in many areas of regulation in the U.S., states even have uniform codes. They work together on it. So, look, sure, there's going to be places where maybe things don't work perfectly. But you know what? States have the ability to protect their citizens, and some of them want to go beyond what Washington, D.C. is, and I support them doing that.
That's good to know. Well, thank you
Well,
very
thank you
much.
for having me. I
Appreciate your
appreciate it.
coming.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. And so now I'm very pleased to welcome Joanne Stonier, the Chief Data Officer for MasterCard. Joanne oversees the curation and maintenance and management of the data assets that provide value to the customers, banks, governments, us cardholders.
Yes.
She was previously Executive Vice President for Information Governance and Privacy Officer, which is the right person to be here to talk to us about privacy. And once again, we have Yves-Alexandre, our Imperial College London professor with us. So, Joanne, building on this conversation and thinking about MasterCard and your job, your role, and your world, you're charged with delivering on both the promise and the protections of data. And MasterCard does use data very much. And I think I would join with others in the audience who might find themselves, I don't know, surprised but maybe pleased when you get a phone call because there was a charge on your card and it seemed out of order and it seemed strange. Now, as a family that travels a lot and various things, sometimes you get that call because you were actually doing something not your usual place, but we know that someone there or some machine perhaps is looking after us. So I just wanted to think about your use of data to track and find fraud and protect all of us. On the other hand, does it give people the creeps that all of a sudden you're keeping track of the fact that I was in Mexico and then I was in France and then I was here or whatever? And so how do you balance that privacy versus data?
And I was sitting in the audience listening to the commissioner and thinking, we certainly collect a lot of data, right? I mean, there's data that flows through our ecosystem. And so just to be clear, we work with our banks and we work with merchants and we work with governments to spot fraud on the network that we operate, right? So many of you use a card that looks something like this one, whether it's this form factor now or the old plastic form factor, or you key in your digits, your watch. Many of you have a watch on that does this. Many of you now have, there's newer form factors that will be, coming out in your car, for example, dashboard, there will be the ability to transact. But yes, we fight fraud, and we've done that for a really long time. I think the difference is that we cooperate within an ecosystem of players, right? And so when you get your card, so in this case, this card came from Bank of America, right? You understand that part of the benefit of using your card, right, is that we're going to offer you safety and security, right? It's a little bit safer and more secure than cash. You can get your money back, for example, if you're not happy with your purchase, you're going to be credited, as well as the fact that we're looking out for you and that we're really monitoring the system for fraud. And so I think that this is one of the ways that there's a little bit more transparency. You're aware of the use of your data for this purpose. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's where the creepiness factor is a little bit less creepy for you when you get that phone call. And it's also less creepy when actually you understand that you're out of pattern for you, right? So if you travel a lot and you use the same card when you're traveling, you probably don't get those phone calls. You might the first time, but you probably don't get it every time. And it's a conversation that I have with a lot of my friends. They yell at me because they say, I just tried to use it for gas. And so why? Why can't I use it? And why are you stopping me? And it's interesting because one of the things that our fraud models have shown us is that bad guys, right, oftentimes the first place they go with a lost or stolen card is to a gas station to make a small purchase, right? And they stand there with a lot of cards and they try to use them. And so that is why we call you and you're declined at the gas pump and you're enraged about it, right? I oftentimes get the rage that goes with it because you are a respectable cardholder. The challenge is, though, that one of the things that is a challenge in this world where we want to engender more trust is people say to me, well, Joanne, why isn't it a consent model? Why isn't it when I get my card from my bank that we consent into fraud monitoring? And this came up when the GDPR was being passed with profiling, right? Because almost every other kind of profiling, like the commissioner was talking about the ad networks, in Europe, you have to consent for your data to be used to create any kind of data footprint about you. But we actually went and talked to a lot of the members of Parliament and the Council and the Commission at the time to say, did you mean this for the kind of profile I'm creating on my cardholders? Because in a perfect world, all of us who are kind of law-abiding citizens that use my card or the equivalent cards for the right purposes, we're going to say, yes, please use my data to find out if my card is being used for fraud. And all the bad guys are going to say, what? No. And so my fraud algorithms would have incomplete data sets. And so I actually think privacy in this area is a non-starter issue. It's one where it's a very easy to understand use of your personal data. It's a use that makes sense to you. And you understand, if I tell you that we never use that data set for our econometric models, for other kinds of modeling, we anonymize, de-identify, we use a lot of state-of-the-art stuff. Eve and I were beginning to talk about some of our methodologies that we use, because we understand that fraud has to be identifiable to a person. And we have to work on that with our banks to identify you, to notify you. I have to know it's you. At some point in the chain, I have to contact you somehow. And you've provided your contact information to your bank. And so that's how we're notifying you, right?
No, that's really interesting because it's sort of like vaccination then. If you don't, if everybody doesn't agree to it, you don't get herd immunity.
You don't get the protection,
right? You don't get the protection.
And we're not doing it in a vacuum. I mean, but it's interesting because as a data officer, I talk about how we're using increasingly AI to process the data faster and better. And then I have data scientists in the room, and I talk about our ethical AI process and how we try to monitor for bias. And it never fails that some analyst in the room will say, can you share the algorithm? And I'm like, no. Think about it for a minute. I can't share the algorithm because then guess who else gets to see the algorithms, right? It's just, it's kind of a mind-boggling kind of circle.
That's, is this type of theft and fraud on I mean, it's a never-ending problem, I assume. Yeah. Is it on the upswing? Or
Absolutely.
Is it,
I mean, we process every minute. I think the number's up to approximately 66,000 transactions in a minute. It's more than Google searches, right? So just to give you a sense of the processing that we do globally every minute, right? And as the world moves increasingly to an electronic based society, a digital-based society, as 5G becomes more ubiquitous, as payments become part of that, that number is only going to go up. And it means we're going to have to get better and smarter at understanding fraud in a device-to-device world. Right now, we're kind of cloud-based, and we're doing more and more with cloud and how we all interact. And we increasingly are doing things not on the same form factors, right? So when is it legitimately you? And when are you changing devices? When are you adapting the next technology, right? Is really an interesting conundrum for us to spot the fraud and make sure it's you and not somebody who's taken your information and is misusing it because there's been a breach at another organization or at a merchant or somewhere else in the system.
It'd be interesting to turn to Yves-Alexandre then on this issue of vulnerabilities and actually, just from personal experience, it's true. Every time they really did have my card, they were running down the coast and hitting gas stations. But recently, our son lost 2 cards in a row. Very quickly, he blamed it on the scooters you hire in Paris or in various parts of Europe. What are our vulnerabilities? Should we stop doing all this stuff, Yves-Alexandre? We now rely on this so much that you have to, if you want to ride one of those scooters, you have to have a card. You have to have credit somewhere, and you have to have a device, and you have to be able to pay for it. So tiny little things we spend money on now are becoming more and more diffuse like this. You go to Scandinavia, you never even get cash anymore. What you attack all these systems all the time. What are you most concerned about?
That's a difficult one. I think for us, there's a certain inevitability to increasing use of electronic payment methods, increasing use of credit card and other technology that is basically making our life easier. And I think that's definitely great, and this is definitely something that we should not go against, right? When we present our research in re-identifying people in location data, we jokingly say, okay, the data is being collected, this data can be used for good, yet it's so easy, to re-identify you. 4 points are sufficient to uniquely identify someone 95% of the time. The way we all behave is so unique that very quickly you can re-identify someone. And this data will be generated, and we shouldn't go against it. And we shouldn't be like, oh, we're going to take our phone, put it in a metal box to make sure that it doesn't emit outside. I think that will happen. And that's, I think, really where, for me, it comes down to trust. It comes down to what is the data being used for, and how do we find a way to, rebuild that trust? How do we make sure that, good, legitimate use of the data happens? And yes, we all would like our card to not be stolen and for someone to not be able to use the card. Yet there are other uses that we might be a lot less happy about or okay with or being able to understand. It's striking for me when you talk to people and you see some of the understanding of what the data is collected for, from the very clear one because it's directly linked to the business model, like in this case fraud, to completely different use of the data that we might be a lot less okay with. And I think that's really, to me, the main challenge now. We have GDPR, is how do we help people understand what is happening? How do we help find the good legitimate use cases, the one that we want to be optional with a clear consent in a way that someone can understand? And really fundamentally where technology can help when it comes to a lot of the data for good, including some of the work done by MasterCard.
Yeah.
So GDPR is an example. It'd be interesting to hear what you think about, Joanne, and both of you.
Sure.
How it might be improved upon. Are there any things, if you were to write the ideal policy for the U.S., for Rohit or others, what would you do?
The challenge with law is that it lags innovation, right? So GDPR was started to be written about, I think, back in 2008, maybe. We started talking about it, and it wasn't really implemented till 2018, right? It went into effect. And so the challenge is that data innovation is contextual and data innovation leapfrogs law. So I think laws are important because they help kind of stabilize what the baseline requirements are, but they don't necessarily help with the next wave of innovation. And I think it's up to responsible organizations to really understand what is this precious resource that we have that we can innovate with, and how do we do it in a responsible manner? And so when I think about the conversation and just what Yves was talking about, we at MasterCard, we've always taken it very seriously that, fraud is one use case, but the other use case is we've tried to put control where we can. And we're a B2B company. We get data as part of a network. We've always kind of de-identified it or pseudonymized it under the GDPR, which means it's still considered personal data. But we also built a world-class anonymization methodology by actually giving a separate entity, a data trust, the data to actually fully anonymize it to make sure we complied with the GDPR. I think that it was quite onerous to do this. I think we're one of the few companies that actually really went this extra mile. And I think more companies will be adapting to new technologies and new methods as we move forward. So I think sometimes regulation can push you into new direction. I think the challenge, though, for GDPR, for whether it's a U.S. privacy law, I think that as we continue to innovate, I don't know that law can be specific enough or it can wind up being too specific because innovation is going to keep pushing the boundaries, partly because we as society, we push the boundaries in what we want and how we want speed, and we want personalization, and we want customization. At least that's what my marketing people tell me, because I'm like the worst case study, right? But we also want accessibility, and we want to solve world problems, right? We've been talking about climate, we've been talking about disease, we've been talking about trying to, make the world more inclusive and also not have a world of data haves and have-nots. And so can we use our information, can we take our data and create information out of it that's helpful to solve society problems? Well, how do I do that and include all my cardholders in that conversation and make it clear to all of you what my data practices are so that you're comfortable with how MasterCard is governing our data practices, right? So that you know that I de-identify or anonymize the data before I use it, that you can opt out of that analytics process before it even begins is like the first thing. That we understand that you own and control your personal data, but that you understand the benefits that we're deriving, and that I give you control over that. And then I also explain what controls, how transparent I am, how accountable I am, what are the methods that we're using when we solve an econometric problem for a local government, when we work in the United States with FEMA to give FEMA information that we're processing transactions again, and it means the electric grid is coming back on, so FEMA workers can either get gasoline or help impacted communities, allow people back in to look at the damage and look at their belongings. So how do we have that dialogue when the use cases are so specific sometimes? I can exhaust all of you. You may not be interested in that, but if you are, how do I get that information out? And one of the things we've been doing is working on this data responsibility imperative. We have principles that we're designing all of our products up against. And then what we're trying to do is publish our best practices so that you can begin to engage with us. And then really take a page out of the GDPR and the CCPA and others and really rethink about where do individuals want to engage and get information, and what do they really want to know about. In a company like mine where it's really a B2B relationship with a B2C brand, right? You know Priceless, you know us, but what do we really do and how can you find out more? So we're trying to think about the spirit of the regulation, which is individuals want to know more. We want to protect you. We want to offer you transparency. But how do we do that in a way that you actually want to hear it and understand it? Because we know no one's reading the privacy notices. We'll write them. We'll comply with them. But how do we do it in a way that's meaningful? That's what we're working on this year. We're trying to figure that out so that makes sense.
Yves-Alexandre, you work on this question of anonymized data. I don't want you to critique MasterCard's algorithm or not, but you can try to attack it and see how well it holds up. But you have said how one can take anonymized data and then de-anonymize it with 4 pieces of information. And you have an approach to, I think, work on that transition from data to information, allowing people to query data without owning it and de-anonymizing it. What you want to tell us about that?
Sure, absolutely. So basically a lot of so we've been attacking and re-identifying data, I think, for the past 10 years, starting pre-Snowden with mobile phone data and location data, and really showing that no pseudonymized data in today's world is not anonymous anymore.
But
yes,
one of your suppositions is that location data is the re-identifier, right? Most of the time in the data set? Yeah, okay.
I mean,
and I would agree.
It really depends, but location is really interesting, actually, because location is...
It's super personal.
It is very... It's the closest, like everyone loves to have this fingerprint analogy, and you see fingerprints everywhere, but location is, to me, the closest you have to a fairly universal digital fingerprint. Location is the piece of information that exists across a lot of data sets. Mm-hmm. And if you try to reconcile people's profile across data sets, or if you try to re-identify someone, location is probably the first thing I would go for, right?
Yeah.
Because it's extremely high dimensional. There's a lot of place on Earth you could be.
Right, exactly.
And that piece of information exists in credit card data, in mobile phone data, in CDR, in web data. It exists across so many different data sets that this is really the first thing that one can use. And it's also a piece of information that's quite broadly available.
Agreed.
Our attack model is very much, yes, you can easily find, my Foursquare profile, my Facebook, to know that I was here today in Davos, and very quickly use this to really re-identify someone. Yet, actually, even when we published this research, we had people coming back being like, this is absolutely unreasonable. That 4 points of information is unreasonable to assume that an attack model.
But I find that the reason I ask is that we treat location data, location data when it's attached to an individual is, I think, incredibly personally. When you think about each of us has been in Davos, but if you take our phone data, each of our footprints have been very unique, right? We haven't all seen each other today necessarily, right? So it is incredibly unique. But when you take that out, it's harder to, I think, to re-identify. And so we have governance. The reason I'm asking you is we have governance principles around how location even can be used. So I was just curious while I had you, because that is a very powerful data point. It also can be, though, incredibly powerful to assist populations. And so one of the other things that you can do is aggregate information for population impact studies. And so that also is another way of improving and making sure. Yes. So we never give our individualized records out to anybody, and I just wanted to go on the record saying that. But this is more just as a data scientist. I wanted to ask.
And I think for us, but it goes beyond, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And recent work we published actually shows that even aggregate data can be re-identified. Mm-hmm. We attacked systems developed by Max Planck and others that literally only give you aggregate information, yet by piecing the information together and querying the system properly, you can still, pretty much as well as if you had given me the pseudonymized data set, once you have developed and found basically the vulnerability.
I was going to say, and
the
it usually
set
is for... in the United States, this isn't going to translate well for a global audience, but I always talk about if you do a demographic combination in a less populous area, right? So I always talk about an octogenarian, someone who's over 80, who is female, who rides a motorcycle, and then I give it in a less populated state like South Dakota. I'm like, she can probably be found very quickly, and then once you find her, you get to re-identify your data set, right? So I talk about that as an example of this. So, and that's what you're talking about, right?
Yeah, we actually had a paper in Nature Communication a couple of months ago that showed that in the US, 15 demographic attributes are enough to uniquely re-identify virtually anyone in any data sets.
Wow.
99.98% of the time.
I don't have that many data elements, so I'm okay.
Any state, anywhere, very quickly. Basically, it's combinatorial. At some point, it is a question of the piece of information. I agree with you, but most of it, I think, to give credit, I think, to GDPR, it is it was quite visionary. It was quite visionary at the time they started thinking about it. It was, I think, it was before Snowden, it was certainly before Cambridge Analytica, and they already had identified this as being a key issue that had to be discussed and looked at, which I think really they get credit for doing this. The other thing they really get credit for doing when it comes to anonymization, and as a technologist, as someone who comes from academia, it was quite impressive to see that the result of so much discussion, so much lobbying, so much amendment in Parliament, they still managed to come out with a definition of anonymous data that make a lot of sense from a technical perspective. So basically, in GDPR, anonymized data is not defined like it is in HIPAA or other laws as, it's the absence of a certain number of pieces of information or things like this. Something that, as you said, right, it's just not gonna stay true and correct in the coming 5 to 10 years as technology advances. Instead, they were like, okay, anonymized data, it's anonymized unless someone can re-identify it. It's anonymized until someone finds an attack.
Until you
come
along, right?
Which from a legislative perspective is a brilliant way of defining it, right? It really makes sure that the law is built to stay. And yes, there's a new attack that comes out, and yes, data that was anonymous in the past is not anonymous anymore because a new attack comes up, and yes, you need to reevaluate the fact that is this properly anonymized? Is it still properly anonymized? And how do I make sure that in 5 years, if I give a copy of that data set to someone, that still this would be extremely difficult for someone to re-identify? And I think that's really something that I don't know how the discussions are evolving in the US, but I think to the credit of the Parliament, it was visionary back in the days. And when it comes to really what we study as academics, they really managed to get that definition, and that anonymous is resistance to attack right. I know that in the US, de-identification is preferred to anonymization. De-identification, from what I can see, seems to be a slightly weaker or less, resistance to attack notion. But I'm curious to see how that's going to...
I think so. For us, we actually created something that I think even you would agree is anonymous to MasterCard, right? Okay. Right. So we created a separate entity that actually, and we can have a whole conversation, that actually we can't see the underlying data set anymore. What we have to do is we have to actually give that other data set the instructions to actually then get back an algorithm that we can then apply to a de-identified data set, right? Which is very different than most companies. But in the United States and other countries, what we can do is we keep 2 different data sets, right? And we have people who work on one and the other, and we have minimum requirements around aggregations, populations, and the information that can be included there. So it's maybe not as robust, but what it does is it keeps the information inside MasterCard, trying to make it impossible for anyone outside MasterCard to link it.
So I think, Yves-Alexandre, you have a platform, and the idea that you don't just give out the data and let people do what they want with it, but people can query it. You can turn data into information.
And we've come up with ways, we do things to push for social inclusion. And what we've done on that is we've allowed data scientists to come in and work alongside my data scientists rather than give the data set away, right? So there's ways to think through the governance issues that I think also, though, that's where GDPR made it a little bit more difficult for the social impact side, right? That I think new laws could make it a little bit easier for us to push forward with approved methods of research that I think GDPR makes it a little bit too challenging for other parts of society to get together to actually push forward for inclusive research. I also think that one of the areas that I think we're going to have to really speak about as a society are things that were just not contemplated at the time because we didn't know it. So things like fake data, data lineage, data quality. These are all issues that are emerging that we're not talking enough about yet, but are going to be increasingly important as algorithmic thinking takes over in machine learning and artificial intelligence. It's going to be harder for us when the data is of bad quality or of the wrong lineage, and we can't get that moment in time back, and the machine is learning from incorrect inputs. And so some of that has not really been addressed by GDPR or any privacy law. Right. And maybe it's not a privacy issue, it's a data issue. I do see these things converging. I think the other challenge that GDPR and other privacy laws have is that other regulators are trying to regulate by sector, whether it's in the healthcare or financial sector. They're trying to release competition, but they don't understand that the data underlies, cuts across, and so we have some really uneven laws, even in Europe. And so that's another whole issue that we have to figure out, how do we educate everybody so that we can actually function. So those are some of the things I'd like to see as we leapfrog ahead.
I think we have some people who'd like to ask some questions. I want to make sure there's time, so why don't we go with this? Yes.
Hi, thank you. This question mainly goes towards Eva, and then so we're talking about data and privacy, and then one form of data that we all know is facial recognition and the picture that they collect. And I come from China, and where Alipay has recently launched a very interesting way of payment, and that is using your face to pay. And so, how do you balance between privacy and yet you wouldn't have a problem with somebody else hacking into your account if you have facial recognition as one of the way of payment.
Thank you.
And so what do you? Yes.
Thank you. And then just hand it to this gentleman was asking earlier too. Do you want to answer them now, or collect all three of them?
We'll collect all of them.
Yeah, let's collect all three.
All right. Quick provocative question, which is also a very oversimplifying of today's talk. So tell me if you agree with the following. Privacy is dead. Just someone didn't realize it. So everything actually boils down to trust to your organization, but also equity in access to data. The fact that many private organizations do have data, do have access, and not everybody can access with the same common rule that we can decide, if you agree or not.
Right. And then...
Yeah, maybe just 2 points. Interesting what was said on the face recognition. I think the technology challenges that we have, for example, for homomorphic encryption, that means allowing potentially to anonymize big databases, so where you can use, this is one of the things we're launching. I'm extremely scared. I spent 10 years in China. When somebody will have this big database, but on the other side, just saying, like I think in some states in California, like now in France, to ban face recognition would actually be terrible for authentication. So you have that. One very provocative point. It's incredible to see how the Parliament, since 2 years, is on a self-congratulating trend with GDPR. We're currently writing a report because it seems that the impact of GDPR is actually exactly the opposite, because it has created a barrier of entry for those who were already in data analytics. And who are these? The big platforms. So those who want today to enter, and these are the new European competitors, it's quasi impossible because 10 GDPR compliance officers does not move the needle for Google. It moves the needle for a small. So this idea of pop-up regulation. So yes, they were visionary, but as you know, if you're a visionary 5 years too late, it makes no sense. And I'm very worried. I don't know how many of you clicked on yes since this morning. I probably did 10 or 20 times. Because when it's Google, you click yes. If it's an unknown site, you don't. So there's actually this regulation is privileging those who we wanted to battle. And I hope that there will be a recognition among this new EU Commission, and that's my question to you. Do you think people get it? I think the level of understanding, yes, might be right on the definition, but what I see at the European Parliament, and I'm dearly a European, is the level of understanding of how platforms work is terribly low. So you have a lot of work to do to get that out. So do you see that happening with Ursula and her team?
Okay, so there's a lot there. Facial recognition, is privacy dead, and how to have innovative regulation that is timely and effective. And
how do we? All right, you want to do facial recognition, and then I'll try. I don't know.
Sure, happy to.
You do facial recognition.
I mean, facial recognition is, to me, it's impressive, and I love it from a technical machine learning perspective, which I think it's quite impressive as a technology. What's really interesting for me is really when you start thinking about what are good applications of facial recognition. and what are some of the cost of drawbacks of using facial recognition. And one of the main application, as was pointed out, is authentication. And to me, one of the main drawbacks is the fact that the mere fact that excellent facial recognition exists risks enabling and helping potentially mass surveillance. And for me, without entering the discussion on ban, no ban, or these kind of topics, it's really, can we get, again, I'm an engineer, I'm trying to, how can we technically find a balance? How can we have authentication and yet not enable complete mass surveillance? And what I'm unclear about is the extent to which facial recognition really helps today for authentication, as opposed to other methods that would potentially be less dangerous from a privacy perspective, ranging from fingerprint to palm recognition or any other applications, and whether do we really need, when it comes to authentication, do we really need facial recognition, and is really the accuracy you get from facial recognition worth the privacy cost as opposed to other authentication technologies.
Okay.
It's basically I'm an engineer, from a technical perspective, that's how I would look at it.
I'm going to wrap up both the other two questions together because I know we're out of time. So I don't think privacy is dead. I think it is in peril a little bit, but I also think that the next generation is going to hold us accountable in ways that we have not held the systems accountable. And so while I'm a data geek, I'm also an ethicist, and I think that the ethics of the next generation, I think we're going to be held accountable as industry and as society in ways. You look at Greta on climate, they're coming for us on technology and ethics and how information is being used. And they will not just click on yes. They will not allow for binary yes or no anymore. It's going to be up to responsible organizations to be way more transparent, and they're not going to accept yes or no as a blanket answer. It's going to have to be specific. And I think you're going to start seeing a shift as organizations come to the recognition that they have to explain what they're doing. And so for the first use of data, like ours for fraud, you'll accept it. But the secondary use, you won't, and you're going to want a whole lot more of an understanding of how that works and the ability to draw it back, which will require technical solutions to do that. And that is where we're going to have to work together. And it's probably going to also be a yes to allow me to do social impact, right? And a no in certain cases as well. So I do think it will change. When, how long, it's never on my schedule, I know that. But I do think that that is the answer, and that privacy is making a comeback in a big way because of issues like facial recognition, where all of us recognize that that precious right to be left alone, whether it's a human right or not, is a precious right. As we've had a long week in Davos, right? All of us are craving probably at this point just a little bit of quiet, right? And can you imagine when we can't get off that grid, right? At some point, we're going to want to pull back, and the next generation is going to make us. So that's my answer on that one.
That's a great way to help us wrap up. We're very much looking for good regulations that don't stifle innovation. Yves-Alexandre gave me a great line that food safety has not hindered food innovation. So everyone's looking for that perfect combination of protecting themselves and being protected, but also having that great access to all these things we want and all the information we want. And so this has been a very stimulating discussion, and I thank you both, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.